When I inherited my grandfather's old Victorian house nestled on the outskirts of a small English village, I thought it would be a welcome escape from the relentless pace of city life. The house, a sprawling structure of creaking wood and ivy-covered stone, had stood empty for years since my grandfather's passing. Locals whispered tales of its haunted halls, but I dismissed them as mere superstitions clung to by a dwindling rural population. The first few days were uneventful. I spent my time dusting off antique furniture, sorting through moth-eaten curtains, and cataloging the myriad of trinkets accumulated over generations. It was on the fourth day, while exploring the attic, that I stumbled upon a locked chest hidden beneath a tattered sheet. The chest was ornate, crafted from dark oak and bound with iron bands that had rusted over time. Curiosity piqued. I searched for a key but found none. Determined, I used a crowbar to pry it open, the old lock giving way with a reluctant groan. Inside, wrapped in a layer of yellowed parchment, was a leather-bound journal. The cover bore no title, only an embossed symbol resembling an intricate labyrinth. I took the journal downstairs to the study, a room illuminated by the soft glow of afternoon light filtering through stained glass windows. As I opened it, a musty scent of aged paper filled the air. The handwriting was elegant yet hurried, the ink faded but legible. The first entry was dated October 3, 1895, penned by a man named Elias Thornwood, a name unfamiliar to me. His words spoke of his arrival at the house, hired as a groundskeeper by my great-great-grandfather. The initial entries were mundane, detailing garden layouts and weather patterns. But as the pages turned, the tone shifted. Elias began recounting strange occurrences, whispers emanating from empty rooms, shadows that moved without a source, and the persistent feeling of being watched. He wrote of sleepless nights plagued by distant cries that echoed through the halls. On November 12th, he mentioned discovering a hidden door in the cellar, concealed behind a rack of dusty wine bottles. Intrigued, he ventured inside to find a narrow staircase spiraling downward into darkness. His descriptions grew more unsettling as he detailed the subterranean chambers lined with ancient symbols carved into the stone walls. The further I read, the more engrossed I became. Elias described a subterranean network beneath the house, rooms filled with archaic artifacts and inscriptions in languages he couldn't comprehend. He spoke of an oppressive atmosphere that seemed to sap his strength the deeper he explored. On December 5th, his entries turned frantic. He wrote of nightmares that blurred the line between dream and reality, visions of figures cloaked in shadow performing rituals in the depths below. He claimed to hear a constant droning chant reverberating through the walls, a sound that no one else seemed to notice. I paused, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The house was silent save for the ticking of an old clock. Determined to understand more, I continued reading. Elias became convinced that the house was built upon something ancient and malevolent. He recounted finding references to a sect that once inhabited the area, a group devoted to worshiping entities that predated recorded history. His final entries were nearly illegible, the writing shaky and marred by ink blots. The last dated entry was December 22, 1895. It simply read, "They are calling. I must answer." No further pages were written. The rest of the journal was blank. I sat back, processing the implications of what I'd read. Could any of this be true, or was it the ravings of a man descending into madness? My rational mind leaned toward the latter, yet a nagging curiosity compelled me to investigate. That evening, armed with a flashlight and a renewed sense of adventure, I made my way to the cellar. The air grew colder as I descended the creaking stairs. Cobwebs clung to the low ceiling, and the scent of damp earth permeated the space. I scanned the walls, searching for any irregularities. Behind a row of wine bottles covered in decades of dust, I found it, a faint outline of a door, just as Elias had described. My heart pounded as I pushed against it, and with a reluctant groan, it swung open to reveal a dark passageway. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating stone steps that led downward. Every logical impulse told me to turn back, but an inexplicable urge drove me forward. As I descended, the temperature dropped further, and the silence was absolute save for the echo of my footsteps. The staircase ended in a corridor lined with more of the strange symbols Elias had mentioned. They seemed to writhe under the flashlight, patterns twisting in ways that defied logic. I pressed on, entering a chamber where the air felt heavy, as if burdened by unseen forces. In the center stood an altar fashioned from obsidian, its surface etched with grooves that formed a shallow basin. Surrounding it were artifacts, statues of indistinct figures, scrolls penned in unknown scripts, and candles long since extinguished. A sudden sense of dread washed over me. The atmosphere was thick with an intangible malice. I backed away slowly, the urge to flee overwhelming. Just as I turned to leave, I heard it, a faint whisper echoing through the chamber, indistinct yet beckoning. Panic set in, and I raced back the way I came, up the stairs, and didn't stop until I was back in the well-lit safety of the study. I slammed the cellar door shut, my breath ragged. That night, sleep eluded me. Every creak of the old house set my nerves on edge. The whispers seemed to follow me, just at the edge of hearing. I questioned whether venturing into the cellar had been a grave mistake. As dawn broke, I resolved to leave the house, at least temporarily, to clear my head and decide what to do next. But as I gathered my things, I found the cellar door ajar, though I was certain I'd closed it. On the floor lay the journal, open to a page I'd not seen before. In fresh ink, the words "You cannot leave" were scrawled across the page. My blood ran cold. The realization hit me that whatever Elias had encountered was not confined to the past. It was here now, and it had noticed me. The line between reality and the impossible began to blur, and I stood at the threshold of a mystery that threatened to consume me, just as it had Elias over a century ago. The morning light did little to dispel the unease that had settled over me. The message in the journal, "You cannot leave," echoed in my mind, casting a shadow over the familiar surroundings. Determined to regain control, I decided to seek help. Perhaps the villagers knew more about the house's history than I did. After all, small towns are repositories of secrets passed down through generations. I drove into the village, a quaint place with cobblestone streets and Tudor-style buildings. The locals eyed me curiously as I parked near the general store. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old wood and spices. An elderly woman stood behind the counter, her eyes sharp despite her years. "Good morning," I greeted, attempting a smile. "I recently moved into the old house on the hill. I'm trying to learn more about its history." Her expression tightened. "Thornwood Manor," she said flatly. "Yes, that's the one," I replied, surprised by the name. "I thought it was called Fletcher House. Names change. Histories don't," she said, her gaze piercing. "Best to leave the past buried." Before I could press further, a middle-aged man entered the store, giving me a cautious glance. Realizing I wouldn't get more information here, I purchased a few items and left. Outside, a younger man approached me. "You're staying at the old Thornwood place?" he asked. "Yes, I am. Do you know anything about it?" He hesitated, glancing around. "Meet me at the pub tonight. We can talk then." Agreeing to his terms, I spent the rest of the day exploring the village, noting the wary glances and whispered conversations that seemed to follow me. As evening fell, I made my way to the pub, a cozy establishment with warm lighting and the hum of quiet conversations. The young man waved me over to a secluded table. "I'm Tom," he introduced himself. "I used to do odd jobs up at the Manor. What can you tell me about it?" I asked eagerly. He took a sip of his drink. "Strange things happen there. People hear voices, see shadows. Some say it's cursed. Do you know anything about Elias Thornwood?" Tom nodded slowly. "Legend has it he was involved in dark rituals trying to bridge our world with others. People started disappearing. After he vanished, the family sealed off parts of the house. I felt a chill. I found a journal. It mentions hidden chambers beneath the house." Tom leaned in. "If I were you, I'd leave and not look back. Some doors aren't meant to be opened." "I tried to leave," I admitted, "but the house won't let me." He stared at me, his expression a mix of fear and pity. "Then you need to find a way to break whatever binds you there." "How?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. He glanced around nervously. "There's an old woman on the outskirts of town. They say she's a witch, but she knows things. Maybe she can help." Thanking him, I left the pub with a glimmer of hope. The next morning, I sought out the woman Tom had mentioned. Her cottage was nestled deep in the woods, smoke curling from the chimney. As I approached, the door opened before I could knock. "I've been expecting you," she said, her voice raspy yet firm. Inside, the cottage was cluttered with herbs, candles, and symbols I didn't recognize. She motioned for me to sit. "You've stirred the spirits of Thornwood Manor," she stated. "I didn't mean to," I replied. "I just want to understand what's happening." She studied me carefully. "The house is a gateway, a nexus of energies both ancient and dark. Elias Thornwood tried to harness these energies, but he was consumed by them. How do I break free?" I asked. "You must sever the connection," she said, handing me a small vial filled with a shimmering liquid. "Pour this over the threshold of the hidden door. It will close the path between worlds." I accepted the vial. "Thank you. Be warned," she added. "The house will resist. You must be strong." Returning to the manor, I steeled myself for the task ahead. As I descended into the cellar, the atmosphere grew heavier. The hidden door loomed before me, slightly ajar as if inviting me back in. Taking a deep breath, I pushed it open. The passageway was darker than before, the symbols on the walls glowing faintly. I walked cautiously, the vial clutched tightly in my hand. Reaching the chamber with the obsidian altar, I felt a presence, an unseen force that seemed to pulsate with malevolent intent. Standing at the threshold, I uncorked the vial and poured the liquid across the entrance. A hiss echoed through the chamber, and the symbols flared brightly before dimming. The air stirred violently, and a guttural growl resonated from deep within. Suddenly, the ground trembled. Stones began to fall from the ceiling, and the walls started to close in. I turned and ran, the passageway collapsing behind me. With a final leap, I burst through the hidden door, slamming it shut. The cellar was silent. Exhausted, I made my way upstairs. The oppressive atmosphere seemed to have lifted slightly. Testing the front door, I found it unlocked. Relieved, I stepped outside, the cool air a welcome contrast to the stifling cellar. Believing the ordeal over, I spent the evening packing. As night fell, a sense of normalcy returned. But at midnight, I awoke to a faint humming sound. Sitting up, I realized it was coming from the cellar. Against my better judgment, I descended once more. The hidden door was sealed, but the humming grew louder. Placing my ear against the wood, I heard whispers, a cacophony of voices overlapping, indistinct yet urgent. Retreating, I resolved to leave at first light. But as I turned, I saw a figure at the top of the stairs, Elias Thornwood. His eyes were voids, and his mouth moved without sound. Paralyzed, I watched as he raised a hand, pointing back toward the hidden door. A sudden force pulled me backward, dragging me toward the sealed passage. I grasped at the steps, splinters digging into my fingers. "No!" I shouted, fighting against the invisible grip. With a surge of adrenaline, I broke free and bolted up the stairs. Elias was gone. Locking myself in my room, I waited out the night, every creak and groan of the old house amplified by my fear. At dawn, I gathered my belongings and fled to my car. The engine sputtered but finally roared to life. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The manor stood silently, its windows like empty eyes watching me depart. Believing I had escaped, I checked into a hotel in the next town. That evening, as I settled into bed, I noticed something on the bedside table, the journal. My heart sank. I had left it at the house. Opening it with trembling hands, I found a new entry. "You cannot run from destiny." Panic engulfed me. The lights flickered, and the room grew cold. Shadows stretched and distorted, coalescing into figures that crept along the walls. Realizing the futility of escape, I knew I had to confront whatever force bound me to the house. The next morning, I returned to Thornwood Manor. The villagers watched silently as I passed, their expressions grim. Back at the manor, I descended into the cellar once more. The hidden door stood open, a yawning abyss beckoning me. Clutching the journal, I stepped inside. The subterranean chamber was different now, larger, with walls that seemed to pulse like a living organism. At the center stood the obsidian altar, and behind it, a swirling vortex of darkness. Elias appeared beside the altar. "You have returned," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. "I won't let this continue," I declared. "I will end it." He regarded me with a hollow gaze. "You cannot end what has no beginning or end. The house is a conduit, and we are its guardians." "Then I'll destroy it," I retorted. He shook his head. "Destruction is impossible. Only acceptance remains." Refusing to believe him, I opened the journal. On the last page was a ritual, a way to seal the gateway permanently. Gathering my courage, I began to recite the incantation. The chamber reacted violently. Winds whipped around me, and the vortex writhed angrily. Elias stretched out his hand, but an invisible barrier held him back. As I uttered the final words, the vortex shrank, imploding into a single point of light before vanishing. The chamber fell silent. Elias faded, a look of relief crossing his features. Exhausted, I made my way back to the surface. The house was eerily quiet, but the oppressive feeling was gone. Stepping outside, I felt the sun warm on my skin, a sense of liberation washing over me. Over the following weeks, I arranged to sell the house. I wanted no further connection to Thornwood Manor. Before leaving for good, I visited the old woman in the woods to thank her. "You've done well," she said, a hint of a smile on her lips. "But be wary. Such forces are not easily contained." "I understand," I replied, "but at least it's over for now." She nodded, her eyes reflecting a depth of wisdom and sorrow. For now, as I drove away from the village, I felt a mixture of relief and lingering unease. In my rearview mirror, the distant silhouette of the manor stood against the horizon, a relic of a dark past. Life gradually returned to normal. I moved back to the city, immersing myself in work and the comforting routines of daily life. Months passed without incident, and I began to believe that the ordeal was truly behind me. One evening, as I returned home from work, I found a package waiting at my doorstep. There was no return address. Puzzled, I brought it inside and opened it carefully. Inside was an old photograph of Thornwood Manor, dated 1890. Standing in front of the house were several figures, their faces blurred with age. Among them, I recognized Elias Thornwood, and standing beside him was a man who looked remarkably like me. A shiver ran down my spine. Flipping the photograph over, I saw a message scrawled in familiar handwriting. "The cycle continues." I dropped the photo, backing away as if it were a venomous creature. The lights flickered, and a sudden gust of wind rattled the windows. Desperation drove me to research my family's history. Digging through archives and old records, I discovered that my lineage was intertwined with the Thornwoods. Generations ago, our families were connected by marriage and shared secrets. Realizing that the bond between me and the manor was deeper than I had imagined, I knew I had to find a definitive way to break the cycle. Recalling the old woman's warning, I decided to seek her counsel once more. Returning to the village, I found her cottage abandoned. The locals claimed she had passed away shortly after my last visit. With no guidance, I felt lost but not deterred. Determined, I delved into occult studies, poring over ancient texts and rituals. I learned of a cleansing ceremony, a way to sever ancestral ties and banish lingering spirits. It was risky and required returning to the manor one final time. Equipped with the necessary items, candles, herbs, and a ceremonial dagger, I made my way back to Thornwood Manor. The villagers watched silently as I passed, their faces etched with apprehension. Entering the house, I was struck by how unchanged it was, as if waiting for my return. The air was thick with anticipation. I proceeded to the grand hall, the heart of the manor. Drawing a circle on the floor with salt, I placed candles at cardinal points and lit them. Reciting the incantation, I called upon benevolent forces to cleanse the space and release the souls trapped within. As I spoke, the temperature dropped sharply. Shadows gathered at the edges of the room, coalescing into forms that surrounded me. Among them was Elias, his eyes filled with a sorrow that pierced me. "You cannot undo what has been woven into the fabric of time," he whispered. "I must try," I replied, continuing the ritual. The shadows closed in, their whispers growing louder, merging into a cacophony that threatened to overwhelm me. The candles flickered violently, the flames dancing erratically. Summoning all my willpower, I grasped the dagger and made a small cut on my palm, letting a few drops of blood fall into the center of the circle, a symbolic offering to seal the ritual. A blinding light erupted from the circle, and a wave of energy surged outward, pushing the shadows back. The house trembled, the very foundations shaking. When the light subsided, the shadows were gone. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, replaced by a profound silence. Elias appeared once more, his form translucent. "Thank you," he said softly. "We are free." He faded from sight, leaving me alone in the dimly lit hall. Exhausted but hopeful, I left the manor, feeling a weight lifted from my soul. The villagers seemed to sense the change, offering me nods of acknowledgement as I passed. In the weeks that followed, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. The nightmares ceased, and the lingering sense of dread dissipated. One morning, I received a letter from a law firm representing an anonymous client. They informed me that Thornwood Manor had been purchased and would be demolished to make way for a new development. Relieved that the house and its dark legacy would be erased, I allowed myself to believe that the cycle had been broken. Years later, I found myself reflecting on the events that had transpired. The experience had changed me profoundly, instilling a deeper appreciation for the mysteries of the world and the unseen forces that shape our lives. I wrote a memoir, carefully omitting certain details to protect others from the allure of the unknown. It served as both a catharsis and a cautionary tale. One day, while visiting a bookstore, I noticed a young woman browsing the occult section. She pulled a familiar-looking journal from the shelf, the same leather-bound book that had started my journey. Approaching her, I gently took the book from her hands. "Be careful with that," I warned. "Some stories are better left unread." She looked at me quizzically but nodded, placing the journal back on the shelf. As I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that despite my efforts, some doors remain open, waiting for the next curious soul to cross the threshold. Perhaps the cycle never truly ends, but continues in new forms, a perpetual dance between the known and the unknown. I can only hope that those who follow will tread carefully, armed with the wisdom of those who came before.